On the topic of memory theory in particular, he made three related observations with respect to form criticism. The first was that memory theory, quote, has a striking similarity to the perspectives of the early form critics, unquote, in terms of how the past is constructed for the present needs of a community. The second observation was that more often than not, the conclusions drawn by memory theorists about particular issues were not different than the conclusions one might have made on standard historical critical grounds. And finally, he observed that in many ways memory theory is just form criticism, quote unquote, with differences in terminology. Foster did not say much more than this about form criticism because he was more concerned with addressing the assumption that commonly appears in the works of those promoting memory theory, that memory theory confirms the general reliability of the Gospels. When Foster claimed that memory studies and form criticism are more similar than they are different, it is important to note that his was in fact a counterclaim. The conversation, or the fight, was started by the tendency of memory theorists to single out form criticism as the main problem that memory theory needs to fix in the study of Christian origins. Memory theorists tend to complain that form criticism falters because the relationship between tradition and the past is too autonomous, too untethered from the salient past. Form criticism had it that only communal present concerns affected the shape of tradition. What was missing, Alan Kirk argues, is any accounting of memory, or a way that the past, or a way for the past to account for the shape of tradition. Memory theory has an ambiguous relationship with the past. On the one hand, they claim, like all modern historians, that we have no access at all to the past. Social memory is not the past, but the way the past has been fit into the present needs of a community. Social memory theorists are interested in how the past is represented, how it is utilized, and to what ends, rather than focusing only on the correlation between a memory and some originating event in terms of accuracy, historicity, and facticity. Continuatist memory theory tends to be interested in explaining the function of these memories. This approach to social memory searches for the meaning that memories are invested with, since that meaning is not dependent on factors such as factuality or veracity. Memory theorists ask why some memories of Jesus exist and not others, why some memories have traction but not others, why Jesus is cast in certain categories but not others. On the other hand, there are assumptions about the continuity between the past and present reconstructions of it in much memory theoretical work. In Schwartz's estimation, quote, reality counts more than bias in the remembering of most events most of the time, unquote. Thus, when most memory theorists contend, along with every other scholar of course, that we have no direct access to the past, they do not generally intend to say that nothing can be known about the past. Some things can be known, continuatist memory theorists widely maintain, because representations of the past are normally limited by past events themselves. That is to say, quite a lot of the past survives into the present. Ledin writes, quote, our memories demand a high degree of continuity in order to tie all of our shifting frames of meaning together, unquote. The construction of memory might involve some creativity, but the past might be malleable, but creativity and malleability are generally limited by the past as it actually happened. So these are, of course, not my opinions. This is my representation of how memory theory tends to work or be articulated. There's only so much the past can be stretched and shaped, they say. It is frequently claimed that social memory theory does not allow us to distill authentic from inauthentic material. In fact, they say even inauthentic Jesus material might in some instances have originated with Jesus himself. This would happen, for example, in the event of a crowd witnessing an event, but different people interpreting it or understanding it or misunderstanding it. And so those misunderstandings can also emanate from a Jesus event itself and then survive down the line. Of those competing interpretations, some will surely be closer to the original intention, but all of them point to an originating event. The common complaint about form criticism is that it was wholly embedded in historical positivism, in that it assumed to be able to reconstruct the past as it actually happened. It is a reasonable complaint, even when historical positivism was widely abandoned among people engaged in historical enterprises. The Jesus book industry was largely unaltered. Consider these book titles that are all post-2010. Jesus, What Really Happened? The Gospel Miracles, What Really Happened? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Always with us? What Jesus really said about the poor? Taking Jesus at his word, what Jesus really said on the Sermon on the Mount. Was Jesus really born? The real Jesus. Will the real Jesus please stand up? So historical positivism is actually still very much alive in the Guild, despite the fact that the postmodern awareness of the construction of the past was allegedly embraced long ago. Positivism, or confidence that the past could be reconstructed, was certainly a key feature of the form-critical historical Jesus scholarship. By contrast, the quote-unquote new historiography, with which memory theory is thoroughly intertwined, quote, can theorize the historical Jesus behind the Gospels. But it does not assume that scholars can access an uninterpreted past reality behind the Gospels. Though the notion that historians do not have access to the past, that their reconstructions are as self-interested and ideological as they are narrativizations, it is noteworthy the extent to which it has been co-opted by memory theorists. On to then resurrection belief. Form criticism shapes the structure of New Testament scholarship in general. For example, as soon as a scholar describes a story or saying being shaped in transmission, she does not need to cite Bultmann or use the explicit language of form criticism. That is how deeply influential form criticism has been. It simply is there in how we think. And it persists because consideration of how the needs of a community and the simple act of transmission through material space shaped the Jesus stories carries considerable explanatory power. When it comes to accounting for the resurrection narrative specifically, Jesus scholarship shows the influence of form-critical thinking in three ways. First, form criticism was part of the positivistic enterprise of distilling the factual from the fictive in the Gospels. In keeping with that goal, the first approach to the resurrection, and likely the most common, is to explain what actually happened, since the literal resuscitation of a corpse, that is the main theological definition of resurrection, is not an historical event. Historiography has come a long way in the last 20 years, but all this really amounts to is a changing of the actually, as in what actually happened, to something more subjunctive. What was the experience that may have been interpreted or articulated this resurrection? The crudest of these explanations, to borrow Raymond Brown's wording, are likely that Jesus' body was stolen, going back to Reimarus and reappearing most recently in James Tabor, or that the experience was one of hallucination, going back to Strauss and Renan, and appearing most recently in Gerd Ludemann. A less polemical version of this approach can be found in accounting for the resurrection as a visionary religious experience. This type of explanation attempts to take seriously the datum that people have religious, that is, ecstatic or mystical experiences, and that the resurrection could well be one of them. For example, Fiend Perkins suggests that resurrection belief was grounded in a real religious experience. Bruce Chilton grounds the visionary experience in Kabbalistic practices taught to the disciples by Jesus. John Dominic Crossan locates the original experience in one of female lament, which was then developed through a male process of exegesis. That the experience can be both real and non-literal is also the conclusion reached when the issue is approached from a cognitive anthropological perspective, that is, alternate states of consciousness, visions, etc. Examples abound here in the Jesus Seminar in case of Ramesh and E.P. Sanders. But the most impressive example is Dale Allison's extensive study of apparitions. He finds nothing at all extraordinary or unique about the gospel resurrection reports, but he does not think a body was raised from the dead. He finds ample evidence of apparition experiences and reports that contain all of the component parts of the resurrection reports of the Gospels. The influence of form criticism on these particular ways of explaining the origin of resurrection belief might not be immediately clear, but I believe it is in the twofold skepticism, that is, concerning the trustworthiness of gospel testimony on the matter, and secondly, the attempt to describe what might actually have happened. A second direction of influence from form critical thinking comes in the form of the well-known criteria. This is, of course, related to the enterprise of discerning what actually happened in the life of Jesus, but when it comes to the question of the resurrection, the criteria are not invoked to argue against them. I never see this to be the case. Rather, they figure in attempts to argue in defense of the accuracy of the gospel record of the resurrection. Again, examples abound in William Lane Craig and N.T. Wright, but the most extensive example is Michael Licona. His defense of the resurrection narratives as reliable according to the universal standards of rigorous historical investigation includes many appeals to the criteria of multiple independent attestation and embarrassment, and occasional appeals to the criteria of dissimilarity and plausibility. He also, like Wright, claims that an actual resurrection is just simply the best explanation for all the data. In this way, these defenses of the resurrection narratives operate within precisely the same historically positivistic form-critical framework as do those who seek alternative explanations. These approaches are similar in that they both seek to establish what actually happened, and in this, the cases for and against equally betray their form-critical framework. A third form-critical approach is less interested in what actually might have happened and more interested in speculating on why the narratives came to be composed. One would call this the Sitzenleben approach, namely the composition of material by early Christians because they needed the material for their missionary work. The best source here is its originator. When Rudolf Bultmann describes resurrection narratives as quote-unquote apologetical legends, he implies that the stories derive from the communal need to defend a belief. Surprisingly, this is all he says in the history of the Synoptic tradition. He says more later, when he argues that the crucifixion and resurrection cannot be separated. The crucifixion was an event. The resurrection is an expression of the significance of that event. As soon as one demands that the resurrection function as an authenticating miracle, one separates the expression from the event and turns the expression into an event. In addition, one shifts the focus away from the historical event, crucifixion, thereby stripping it of its significance. In short, then, for Bultmann, the story of the resurrection is developed as an expression of faith. Does memory theory do a better job of explaining resurrection belief? In time for the writing of this paper, I could only find one example of a memory theorist who discusses the resurrection, namely Jens Schroeder. However, he does so from a thoroughly continuous perspective, in that he is interested in how the memory functions, not in the origin of the memory. Schroeder argues that early Christians held the conviction, Schroeder argues that early Christians held the conviction that God was active in history and that Jesus was part of that history. Therefore, the execution of Jesus, quote, placed his adherents before a fundamental alternative, inasmuch as they either had to abandon the conviction of the action of God in him or integrate his death into this conviction, end of quote. That this integration was full and effective can be seen in the ways resurrection belief informs the theology of Paul, the Gospel of John, and the Gospel of Thomas, as well as in the willingness of people to suffer, defending their resurrection beliefs. Schroeder does not argue for the historicity of the event, but for the historicity of the belief. How does this differ from a form-critical explanation? Of course, it depends on which aspect of form criticism one considers. Obviously, it is very different from the criteria approach, which focuses on the event and argues for or against it. But what about the Sitz-im-Leben approach? Schroeder's is an explanation that accepts that resurrection belief was an indisputable fact among early Christians, but seeks to explain its origins elsewhere than in the actual event as narrated in the Gospels. The implication in Schroeder is that the belief originated out of a need to maintain coherence. Abandoning the faith that God was active in Jesus' life was perhaps intolerable to early Christians, so they found a way to articulate their faith, their conviction, in a way that maintained that faith, a resurrection narrative. In other words, the pressing needs of Christ followers in the wake of the death of Jesus manufacture a memory as an expression of their historical faith. Historical in the sense that it was real, and in the sense that God is active in their history. I'm really not convinced that there is a difference between memory theory and form criticism here. Having said that, in other ways, his approach, that is Schroeder's, is pointedly anti-form critical, such as when he problematizes the Palestinian sayings versus Hellenistic narratives dichotomy. On the other hand, a subsequent discussion on this topic by Schroeder makes me wonder whether he would in fact think that memory theory has any part in a conversation about the resurrection at all. In a brief discussion on the birth narratives, he describes them as, quote, mythological and legendary narratives. Because of that, he claims, they cannot be called memories. He writes, to establish memory as a suitable category in Jesus' research, it is therefore necessary to distinguish it from receptions that are not bound to traces of the past, but are rather legends or fiction. Presumably, he would classify resurrection narratives in the same way, and thus argue that they are not memories. I strongly would disagree with this for two reasons. Schroeder here appears to require that factuality be a component of memory. Not accuracy per se, but actuality, that something stands at the origination of that event. This is an odd claim to make when in the same article he argued that the meaning of memory does not reside in its facticity. In this particular paper, Schroeder appears to demand that there must be some relationship between memory and facticity. It is not that memory is a reliable reflection of that past, transporting us back into the past, but it is the case that a representation of the past cannot be called a memory if it is not connected, like a fishing line to a flailing fish, to some originating event. Schroeder's perspective here does not work either for individual episodic memory nor for social, collective, or communal memory, and worse, it departs from the field of memory studies quite sharply. There, legends, fictional novels, and movies, this is a quotation from his article of all the things that memory can't be applied to, legends, fictional novels, and movies are in fact treated as instantiations of collective memory, and fabrications and delusions are part of the phenomenon of memory. Accounting for the complex phenomenon of memory must include the human capacity for holding memories of events that did not happen. This raises the one way in which I think memory theory might do a better job of explaining resurrection belief than form criticism, namely in the subtopic of memory distortion. The study of memory distortion considers the way in which the memories people hold can be distorted by forgetting or by exaggerating details, both of which can change the perception or of meaning, as well as issues of culpability and self-representation. Sometimes these distortions are inconsequential to the story. Sometimes their consequences are considerable. And to refer to a comment I made earlier, one sees this in the redaction critical changes that the gospel writers make. Sometimes the changes are inconsequential. Sometimes they're considerable. Sometimes this applies to individual eyewitness or episodic memory, but it also applies to social memory. We are often given our memories by the group around us, wherein membership in that group means accepting the memories we are given. In this way, we can inherit memories that become our own, and through ritual enactment and communal belonging, they can come to feel as real to us as our own, sometimes no less distorted memories. The past is filled with examples of people holding beliefs relating to events that we know perfectly well never happened. So many memory theorists talk about the relationship of the past to the present as mutual and interdependent. The past, they say, does not precede the present, nor vice versa. The past bears some imprint on the present. This sentiment abounds in works using social memory theory. But where do these sentiments leave us when we're dealing with events that, to borrow the words of Rafael Rodriguez, bear no significant relation to the actual past? Being pretty gentle there. Rodriguez's acknowledgement of strong distortion, by which he means wholly fabricated, is uncommon among New Testament memory theorists. Either it is not addressed at all, or it is dismissed as overblown and methodologically suspect, such as we find in the work of Alan Kirk. But the resurrection of Jesus is actually only the most extreme example of material, of many examples that are less extreme, such as miracles, that should force memory theorists to say more about memory distortion in Rodriguez's strong sense. This is the limitation of this approach to social memory, for it almost imagines no instances of wholly manufactured memory, and thus leaves the many instances of this unaddressed or inadequately theorized. Our understanding of the resurrection narratives is enriched by a theoretical approach to memory distortion. It cannot, I think, explain the origin of these narratives. For that, I think we need to side with Dale Ellison and similar approaches that posit a real, visceral, and powerful experience at the point or points of origin. The resurrection narratives are memorialized articulations of that experience, likely inherited as opposed to composed by the gospel writers. They are also an example of social memory, in that the writers relate memory that is not their own. And they are examples of distorted memory, in that they relate the experience by inventing an event. It is not at all a stretch to accept that the experience can have felt real and powerful without having happened in the way narrated. What is more, it is also consistent with the study of memory distortion to admit that one person's experience could have been relayed to others in such a way as to become the authentic experience of others as well, eventually, say, reaching 500 others in addition. Perhaps this approach is not very different from the form-critical approach, which sees in the resurrection narratives a creative fiction rather than a straightforward report of the event. The form-critical approach that concludes, based on the abundance of data, a separation between history and tradition, that attempts to account for the creative traditions and adaptations of the early Christian trade-ins, is not so far removed from the memory distortion approach. For example, concerning miracle stories, Bultmann accepts that some of the stories might derive from historical events, but, quote, their narrative form has been the work of the tradition, end of quote. It might not be memory theory, but it's not that far off. And it must be stressed that neither is it the claim nor the implication of memory distortion that all memory is inherently unreliable and never to be trusted. It's that memory distortion is common enough to warrant attention, and that it is often impossible for the rememberer to tell the difference between an accurate memory and a heavily distorted memory. My conclusion. Many individual elements related to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection have not survived scientific scrutiny and advances. After several hundred years, one would expect and hope that that would be the case. Nevertheless, the theory still stands, generally because of its tremendous heuristic power. Similarly, not all of Bultmann's operating assumptions have survived. For instance, the early form-critical assumptions that the Gospels are a mix of earlier oral and later interpretive traditions of the early Christians, that the tradition developed in a predictable manner, and that the oral and written strands of tradition can be neatly separated, have been largely abandoned. Chris Keith calls these central assumptions, but I think they are better understood as secondary assumptions. These assumptions are secondary because they were explanatory. They were part of the attempt to explain what must be called form criticism's primary assumptions, and these primary assumptions have stood the test of time. These primary assumptions are as follows: that material emanating from Jesus must have been adapted as it moved from an Aramaic Palestinian setting to a Hellenistic setting, that it must have been shaped by its transmitters as it was used in a variety of settings, and that it must have been shaped again by the literary and theological interests of the gospel writers, even to the point of creating new material that did not emanate from Jesus. The heuristic power of these assumptions is so strong that they still stand despite the fact that the secondary assumptions that helped to explain them were proved unworkable. For instance, when Jens Schroeder concludes his excellent paper on memory theory and historiography as it applies to the study of the historical Jesus, the primary assumptions of form criticism are, rightly and reasonably, I contend, quite apparent. Conversely, the idea that individual traits must be removed from their narrative context in written text and reorganized under categories of forms is absent from Schroeder's approach because it is not a primary form critical assumption. To this extent, I think memory theory is a right and reasonable extension or correction of what is essentially still a form critical enterprise, the attempt to explain how material that might go back to Jesus was shaped by the process of transmission from an originally Palestinian through the establishment of Greek associations to the written gospel. We've added some cars to the train, spruced up the paint, and tuned up the engine, but we're still on the same set of tracks. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great paper. Airtight is probably the right word. Yeah, I'm still baffled over Jens Schroeder with the birth narratives not being memory. Yeah, I don't know if I have like a direct question other than how does, I guess maybe just if you can elaborate a little bit on his approach or how memory seems to be worked out within his studies.
I don't know if I want to be called upon to be a specialist, a Jens Schroeder specialist.
Okay.
Because I don't know that I would do it fairly. I don't know that I've read it so carefully that I can really do justice to his thinking. In general, he is part of a school, I think, a group of social memory theorists who I think are who assume too strong a link between past and present. And so we've talked about, Peter and I, the form criticism and versus social memory, and it's come up in other conversations and papers. And I think the distinction might be as simple as this. Form critics, I think, we're working from the front end of the train, looking back through the cross, right? Bultmann's cross. That the shape of the tradition is influenced by the present needs, looking back through the resurrection, through the cross, and so they're fully shaped and informed by that. Okay, so from the front looking back. I think that many of the New Testament memory theorists, looking at the same linear line, are working from the other end, saying it's the other end that is pushing. It's the impetus is from the past. They talk about the force of the past, the influence, that there is for them, I think, always, and I think this is something else I'm going to write about them, but that it's always assumed, it's implicit, that there's a past actual event that can't be accessed, but is there behind the curtain. And that the force of that shapes the present. They do not deny that the present also shapes it, but that it's 49-51 or it's 60-40, but the impetus is from the back end, from the originating end. That's a pretty subtle difference, whether the force is coming from the present or whether the force is coming from the past, but I do think it's an important one, and I think it's an unacknowledged one, in much of their work.
So thank you very much. The first idea I had, considering the instructor, is that, but it's not just a problem of terminology, right? Whether he's not only opposing the idea of using the word memory so broadly. So if you just imagine that he would, for example, or I would distinguish between memory as the word we actually use in like common speech for something that I am remembering, or it's sort of recollection of family or whatever. And on the other hand, the legend. That's what he used there. That's he put the memory, and on the side was fantasy, legendary. And obviously, in the memory theory, it also works with how this type of legends could work in reception, in further effective history, right? But at the same time, it also causes a sort of confusion, because that's not how we use the word normally in our life. Obviously, in the theory it works. And so that's first observation, that it might be only a problem of terminology.
Okay, on that I would say he's writing a scholarly piece, so use it in a scholarly way, not in the popular way. Because in the scholarly discourse, legends are a form of memory. Especially when the group is giving them to you. So they're not a form of individual episodic memory. They are a form of social or collectivistic memory. That is the memories we hold that we've been given by our group. We hold them to be true. We experience them as our own, right? So I don't think I think you might be right, except he's writing a piece of scholarship.
Yes, I see, but what you just said, it could be also used as what you use as a memory could be substituted by stories, and the stories could be either memory or legend. But yeah, I see that while we are using sort of methodology based on some scholarship, obviously it makes sense. The second idea I had was from what I get from the Professor Pokorny paper and yours, is also a different terminology again, because as we are using the word memory for our memories, what we are actually dealing with, approaching New Testament, Professor Pokorny uses the word testimony. And I consider both to be a metaphors. Professor Pokorny takes it over from Ricker, am I right? Yes, the testimony, yeah, the analysis of testimony. Here it's obviously taken over from social memory field. So there are two different backgrounds. One is philosophical, from philosophical hermeneutics, second is from sociology. But both metaphors consist of a whole image for me. Because if you have a memory, you start with a trial, and you have witnesses there. If you start with the testimony, you have a trial and witnesses there. And what you are trying to do is to get from the witnesses their witness about the past. Well, no matter whether it's accurate or inaccurate, whether the testimony is authentic or not authentic, but obviously you are a judge, and now what do? You have to distinguish, you have to have a certain set of criteria how you will evaluate the testimony. And we are back again with the criteria, right? It's like, for example, if you have several independent witnesses, obviously, if the witness would be possible to trace that he was a part of the event, of his understanding of the world. For example, if you can remember how the room where the murder occurred looked like, it's more plausible than those who has no idea. And what I'm just saying is that I'm not really sure that this criteria is therefore so tightly connected to form criticism, considering the fact that none of them were formulated before the reduction criticism started playing part in the history of critical scholarship. So what I'm just trying to say is that I believe that there are sort of two metaphors for memory, and on the other hand is testimony. Testimony obviously questions more about the past, but I believe thinking about that the witness is not like the direct witness, he's having his frameworks, everything, mythology, whatever. He's not necessarily authentic witness. He has his flaws. We know that. And on the other hand, there's a metaphor of memory, where when you know the thing, it's always flawed, everything, but you are more concerned with how the processes of memory, how the constructions work, how So you are looking, it's what you just said, you're looking more to forward, where there you look more backward. But I believe the hermeneutical processes are the same. It's a different set of questions, maybe.
I'm not sure I would put memory and testimony as, well, I can't wrap my head around, as you seem to have, seeing memory as a metaphor. But I also can't put memory and testimony as even parallel metaphors, because I think you stopped short in your analogy of the judge who is trying to assess the competing testimonies, because there we actually return to memory. That these competing testimonies exist, the contradictory and the malformed testimonies exist because of the processes of memory. Cognitive when it comes to eyewitness, but when groups have competing testimonies, those are competing social memories. So and I see testimony as part of the way we theorize. In fact, testimony might be the datum, and memory is the theoretical framework with which we analyze the datum. They're not equal. One is a bit inside in the theoretical framework with which we are, with which we interpret them. That's the analytical framework.
Well, I would disagree, but I'm trying to thinking about it a little bit. I use the testimony and the trial setting because I wanted to separate it terminologically from the memory. That was my point. Obviously, the witness...
It is memory.
No, the witness is using memory, obviously. But at the same time, what we use as a memory is cultural, collective, and social memory. It's not the same memory in this sense. It's not the same word. Just substitute, just lose the word memory at all, and just substitute it with something else. That's the experiment I'm trying to do.
Okay.
So the methodology of social memory studies, I think there might be a different word to use in memory for that, and different word for memory of, for example, of my grandma I had, and I can tell you some stories about her from what we experienced together. Okay. Memory is the same, but I'm trying to find that's what I mean by metaphor. That this memory, the social, the collective, the cultural memory, it's for me just based on the word usage, different from my personal memory, because yes.
I don't think they're different.
Okay.
So that's where we disagree. I don't think we need to come up with a new nomenclature, because I don't think there are grounds to suggest that individual memory is different qualitatively, quantitatively, cognitively, emotionally from social or group memory. Only if you assume, I think as Jens Schroeder ended up doing in that article, that what in order to be memory, as in the stories you have of your grandmother, it has to be connected to an actual past event. If that's what you think memory is, well then, yes, social memory as a term doesn't work, but that's not how the discipline is functioning. That's not how memory theorists are talking about when they talk about fabricated or illusory individual cognitive memory. When they talk about the errors that eyewitness testimonies make, they still use the word memory for that. They don't suddenly try to apply a new term because, now we realize this is wrong, so it can't be a memory. Yeah. So there's no connection. They're not the rest of the field isn't making a connection between accuracy and whether or not it's a memory, which is why legend, to my mind, doesn't change that.
Actually, if I can add, in the field of law, eyewitness testimony is least accurate sometimes, right?
Oh,
You talk
yeah.
to lawyers. Anyway, you don't.
I want to put it more direct on the topic here.
Thanks. I was in the road just like I hopefully can say something about memory, because memory, there are different kinds of memory, so we cannot speak about memory. There are different forms of memory, but also socially or politically, we have, many of us still have an experience of the communist time. There was a social memory which was prevalent, dominant in this country, and only individuals had different memory. They lived in accordance with this memory, and later on, after the revolution, this individual memory changed social memory but they were different. My experience from my youth is that my memory was totally different from the social general memory in the whole entire society. I was a dissident, so I belonged to the opposite side. I met few people who we could speak about the social memory of few dissidents, hundreds in this country in comparison to 50 millions of people. Yes, so it was, and still, even within this dissident group of people, we had individual memories and different memories. There was quarrels in the dissident movement. Yes, still. So it's difficult to say that it is the same. No, my experience is it is not the same. Not only in the past, but still I have a different memory, my own personal memory, which is different from the memory of the whole society.
So I'm not saying the memories are the same.
Yeah.
I'm saying that the phenomenon of memory, theoretically, I think is like how it functions in us is the same, whether it's individual or group. But I wasn't saying that all people have the same memories.
But I was
Okay.
it works differently in society, which is in the he, she, it form, and my personal memory, my private life is different from the public life. Yes? So it plays a very important role. I think this Aristotelian distinction between oikos and polis should be rehearsed, should be repeated again, because there is much speech about private. What is private? Yes. So I think it plays a very important role. Whether the Gospels are public or private. Are they public? What does it mean? Political? Are they political for expressions of the faith? Yeah, maybe it was political. I've read some books about how Gospels were created. Yes, Atwell, for example, wrote a book about that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Josephus Flavius, yes. So, and he has good arguments. So it was simply a political task he got from Vespasian to write the Gospel. So maybe it is a public memory, but let's try to find a private memory about Jesus. And hopefully I will speak about it a little bit.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll come around. I was very tempted just to say something, because my father told me he was also a dissident here. And as later in life, as I understood his retelling of the accounts, it was amazing how his individual memory was shaped by the dissident group. And their assumptions of the West, freedom, justice, all of those things they had in common, and they would give their lives for, but they weren't individual. They were all leaning towards a microgroup where they associated their sense of freedom with America or with other things, and that formed their individual memories. So that's just the response.
To some extent, but still we had our private memory.
Yeah, but Hogwarts is asking how does that shape?
Family memory.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd like to ask a personal question. As I'm not part of your field, I'd be very interested in your, how do you see the role of social memory theory within biblical studies?
In what? Sorry?
Within biblical studies as a whole. Is it a method? Is it a way of interpretation? And what role does it play within your field of science?
I think memory theory is too young. I think it hasn't figured out any one path. I think what we see is people are still working out what memory theory is precisely and how to apply it. And so we have some who are very optimistic about the reliability of memory, and therefore that the Gospels are reliable repositories of early Christian memories. And those who, on the other end of the extreme, are like the form critics, suggesting that memory is malleable. Memory needs to have no relationship to the past, or at least to past actual events. Both are memory theory, right? So there isn't one memory theory path. I do think that memory theory at this point is a way of thinking about the Gospels. I think that it's a way of thinking that can allow us to say things about the pre-gospel past. I think memory theory does allow us to speculate, but things that possibly happened and things that possibly didn't happen. I don't think the criteria way of thinking is totally anathema. I think that, for example, I think Ledun does a reasonable job of, he's calling it memory theory, but he's using the criterion of multiple independent attestation and of embarrassment throughout. And I think it works. I think he combines the both. It's funny that a couple of years later, he's part of the group that writes the demise of authenticity. So I don't know where he stands now. A plus B equals, I don't know where he is. But I think of it as a way of thinking about about the process. And so perhaps that's why I don't find it that different from form criticism, because I think the kernel, or as I called it, the primary assumption of form criticism was also a way of thinking about the process, because there's a process there. So we're all just trying to figure it out. Yeah, but the process from Jesus to the Gospels, that's the one. If we're going to accept the historical existence of Jesus, and we accept the historical existence of the Gospels, then we have got to come up with a way of explaining how we went from A to B, because they're not the same on so many levels.
Oh, it's not even a question. I just wanted to finish up by thinking that I believe that what I thought is that maybe if you use memory for almost everything, how it's just used now, we might lose a lot of nuances during the process. If we just forbid ourselves to use the memory for a while, and we will try to describe the processes with different words, I think it might be much clearer. There's so many different processes going on there, and it's not very helpful to just group them all as a memory. While it might be, if you use it very broadly as a metaphor, I believe, then it's always a memory. But all the processes, it might be very confusing if you just drop it there.
On the other hand, it might be extremely enriching that the language of memory, the framework of memory, is a way of talking. Actually, as you and I have been observing, allows people in completely unrelated disciplines to talk to each other. Memory is a way of talking, a discourse. Then we're looking at a text, we're looking at cognitive eyewitness testimony, and we're looking at a statue. And we can all talk to each other about how these things are instances, instantiations of memory. That those things participate in the manufacturing and the construction of memory, I think is really enriching.
Well, I would say that all you just described was already, in some sense, thoroughly done in philosophical hermeneutics without using memory that much, and without using the word memory so misleading, considering the general use of the word. That would be my follow-up.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you there too. Not on the hermeneutical bit, but I think as scholars, we're not limited by popular usage. We use the word myth all the time in a way that completely does not match popular usage, and that's the value in what we do. So just because the public uses memory differently, I don't think that should limit us.
Sure, you don't have to be limited by it, but in the end, we might end up reading 20 papers entitled social memory and Jesus, blah, 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 and you realize that none of them are speaking about the same thing, but they're using the same word, and I think this is one of the reason why it's so, because there is no further eagerness to go further from this one word and try to be very articulate in what it actually means for me, and I believe that there might be a different language already developed in for example, as I would say, in the hermeneutics, which would help to put it out a little bit. But yes,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.